karanasan ko po, yun na ba nakasalanan ng media?
Media educators are warning calls to become press freedom.
This corruption in media won't be reduced to
In the Philippines, the 70s and 80s were some of the scariest times in modern history. It was when then-President Marcos ruled the country with an iron fist, more so when he declared martial law in 1972.
Placing the entire Philippines under martial law.
Many remember it as a dark time when no one was allowed to say anything against the government for fear of being imprisoned or worse. In 1986, 3 years after the assassination of Senator Ninoy Aquino, over 2 million people rallied in EDSA opposing and resisting the rule of Marcos. After 4 days of revolting, Marcos and his family escaped to Hawaii, relieving the Philippine people from his dictatorship. 28 years have passed, and the memories of the EDSA revolution have been reduced to dull chapters in school history books. In fact, many of today's youth do not appreciate the history and significance of the People Power Revolution, remembering it only as a date in history and as a shrine in front of a mall. As the reason for bringing back democracy to our country, how can the modern Filipino appreciate the significance of the EDSA revolution and live on the promise of the movement? And will it still have bearing in the generation of the next 28 years? Good evening, you're watching News Cafe on the Solar News Channel. February 25 marked the 28th year since the EDSA People Power Revolution. Tonight, we are joined by two young people who will be giving us their take on the revolution that brought back democracy to the country. Dr. Nicole Curato is a researcher from the University of the Philippines and Australian National University. She has written numerous papers on the EDSA revolution and social trends on the government and elections. She is a contributor in websites such as Rappler and the quarterly publication Manila Review. Good evening, Nicole. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for inviting me.
And our next guest is Dr. Lisandro Leloy Claudio, who rose to cyberspace fame after calling out to Senator Tito Soto during the alleged plagiarism scandal. He is a professor at the Ateneo de Manila University teaching history and political science. His book, Taming People's Power, The EDSA Revolution and Their Contradictions, analyzes how Filipinos remember and commemorate the People Power Revolution of 1986. Good evening.
Good evening, Mitzi.
All right, well, thanks again for being on the show.
Thank you.
Now,
Thanks.
both of you were babies during the People Power Revolution. I'd like to ask your views, your initial views on EDSA 1 for you, Nicole. What was your take?
Well, I think as for a lot of people in my generation, we experienced EDSA through school and all of these documentaries. Of course, we didn't have any first-hand experience. My parents, unlike Leloy's parents, are your average middle-class families who aren't so political, but also wanted the dictatorship out. So in terms of the narrative of what EDSA is like, it was experienced and told to me like a standard fairy tale. And I think that is a common experience for a lot of apolitical families at that time. So nothing spectacular, a bit dry and repetitive sometimes, especially if you're hearing it for the 6th time because you're in grade 6. So it's also good to have a retrospective on what that all means now that we're in our late 20s and in my 30s.
And now 28 years after.
Yes, exactly.
For you, Leloy, well, your parents were leftist activists.
Yeah, they were members of the Communist Party during that time, which was for the longest time at the forefront of the anti-Marcos struggle. I think for many people in my generation, we don't realize that EDSA was a moment, first and foremost, of relief. I mean, you had 2 decades or more than 2 decades of a very repressive dictatorship wherein you were fearing for your life. If you printed something that was against the government, you could be sent to jail, you could be tortured. So for many people, it's just like, thank God this is over. And I don't think we can understand that sense because we never went through martial law.
Yeah. What do you think of your peers, your friends, the youth today? What are their views on this? Because it's like you said, we could never fathom what the repression was during the time martial law was, and then the shift to democracy. Do you feel that the current generation today really understands it?
I think it's easy to take it for granted. And I'm really disturbed that there is this whole counter narrative of how we're better off during the martial law, and how I was looking at statistics earlier, and apparently 20% of the population still think that authoritarianism isn't that bad. And it's kind of frustrating, because I think at this point, authoritarianism should be at the same level as genocide. It should be one of those things that's unimaginable and undesirable. But I think it's precisely that. It's the lack of comparison and the lack of first-hand experience of how it is to be under an authoritarian government. And that's the tricky thing, because these things cannot be taught. That's why the counter-narrative is so easy, because now that it's difficult times for the Philippines, the alternative is always the extreme. And I think it's frustrating because it shows a lack of imagination of, you know, what kind of democracy do we want, rather than do we want to go back to authoritarianism.
We have no idea what that time was like.
Yeah, I mean, I tell my students, it's easy to complain about the democracy we have now. But just because things are bad, that shouldn't prompt you into an extreme solution like authoritarianism. I mean, you can't imagine what it's like for the rights of everyday people to be hindered the way it was during the time of Marcos. So on the one hand, I don't judge. I understand that there are many frustrations. I understand that despite the EDSA revolution, many of the same power elite are still there. A lot of the poverty and the inequality is still the same. So I don't blame youths for wanting to look for solutions elsewhere. But that same drive should be funneled into avenues that are also critical of previous models, i.e. authoritarianism.
And we will be talking about those avenues later on, but I'd like to bring up your book, Lelo. You have this with Taming People's Power, the EDSA Revolutions and Their Contradictions. You talk about the narrative, the people power narrative. Explain this and the mythology surrounding it.
The premise of the book is that EDSA shouldn't be just treated as an event, because actually EDSA is very simple. If you want to look at the chronology, it's 4 days, people massing up in EDSA. But what's become more relevant, especially after the death of Cory Aquino and the election of Noynoy, is the mythology that surrounds EDSA. So I think that how we talk about EDSA, what it represents, it's very, very indicative of what is happening now in Philippine politics.
Yes. And you, Nicole, you've written in Rappler about the current administration. In the last sauna by Pinoy, you mentioned that you talked about the president as a spin doctor. Why did you say that?
Well, it's because a president always has to defend his policies. I understand that. But a president should also be honest to his people, and he should always give a sense of justification for what he does. And sometimes spin is not enough. Sometimes a PR propaganda machine is not enough. More important than that is responsiveness. And I think that's one of the key things we fought for in EDSA. It's accountability. It's also about transparency. And I understand that the government has been very, very clear in institutionalizing mechanisms for transparency. But it's also always actually not enough. And that's what criticisms are always saying at this point, right? That we have an article in the Manila Review right now that talks about how the president is fighting corruption through patronage, through dispensation of pork barrel before NDAP, as accused by his critics. So it's one of those things that really stand out in the current administration, that when you really want to institutionalize reforms, the process of institutionalizing it should also be accountable and transparent. We cannot shortcut these reforms.
And in terms of reforms and looking at issues that keep coming up, of course, Hacienda Luisita, which the Aquinos are linked to, always comes up. And this is in your book also, Lelo, you mentioned it. And why is it such a big part of your book, Hacienda Luisita?
I used Hacienda Luisita. I did like 2 years of ethnographic fieldwork in Hacienda Luisita back and forth. And I use it as an example or as a case study of the communities and the peoples that are left behind by major political changes like EDSA. So it's very easy for, say, like a middle-class activist from Manila to say EDSA was great because now I'm not going to be repressed anymore, I'm not going to be jailed. But for the people in Hacienda Luisita, after EDSA, what happened was the promise of agrarian reform basically disappeared because now their landlord was president and her brother, Piping Coangco, was very influential now in Congress, and that led to basically the end of any hopes for agrarian reform in Hacienda Luisita. I mean, there might be land redistribution within the next year or the next 2 years, but how long did that take? What was the gap between 86 and now? And it took an argument between the president and Chief Justice Corona for the ruling to actually happen. And so this is what I talk about in the book, which is that the promise of EDSA it's a true promise, but it's an incomplete promise. And if you look at the margins of Philippine society, the margins of local politics, there are so many more contradictions that are elided by the nationalist EDSA narrative.
Well, you talk about the promise of EDSA, right? And also looking at the spirit of EDSA, the first one, we had many other people power revolutions after. What did you think of those, Nicole, following the EDSA dos, tres? How did it change?
It's interesting that you point that out because as Leloy points out in his book, revolutions are always narratives. The political thing about revolutions is how we remember, and we call it the politics of memory. And of course, some people would say that that's such a revisionist understanding of history. Maybe we have to go back and find out the real essence of what these revolutions mean. But I think the even more interesting question is to have that debate on what we want it to mean at this point in our history. So for example, looking back on EDSA dos, at some point in history, people judged that favorably, that we ousted a corrupt, womanizing, democratically elected president. But right now, the narrative has changed, and we have statistics here that actually say that 42% of the population did not favor any of these revolutions. And so it's a changing narrative on how people kind of negotiate what this means, because I think ultimately these revolutions are judged based on their outcomes. But what we also have to remember is that the outcomes of revolutions are always incomplete. And that demands more participation from the people. Now, we can't just go to a rally, oust the president, and then leave it to the government elite, because precisely the point, it's the same people who are part of governance.
It's a vicious cycle.
It's a vicious cycle, and we are all part of that. We're all guilty of that, because we can't just step back after a revolution and trust that the usual elite will just step in and change, because that will never happen.
What about, they're saying that people power is now going online, so that through cyberspace, citizens can do people power. How do you feel about that? This is your generation, you know, the internet generation.
I mean, to some extent, it's true. You use the mechanisms that are available to you and the mechanisms that appeal to people. And definitely for millennials, the internet is an important venue. But it's always, I think, you know, and I'm going to be really traditional about this, politics is still about showing up physically. It's still about talking to people. It's still about engaging people. And it's about actually doing things apart from just liking on Facebook or having messages that represent your advocacy.
Sharing.
I mean, lobbying means you have to go to people. Lobbying means you have to talk to your congressman. Lobbying means you have to attend meetings. And I think the internet is never going to be a replacement for these things.
I think the best example for that is what happened, for example, in the pork barrel scam, right?
Yes.
Of course, the Million People March happened. Of course, it happened online. But a lot of the concrete changes actually happened when people went to the Supreme Court and filed a petition. The same is true for cybercrime. There were lots of online activism, but what really set the difference is when people again filed a complaint in the Supreme Court about this. So it's always that combination of online pressure and offline organizing. And I think that's what a lot of the millennials are probably still have to understand, that a lot of activism has to do with organizing. It can happen on Facebook. Facebook can facilitate that, but the hard work really happens offline. So let's not take that for granted.
It reminds me of your article in Rappler. You talked about how people have to get serious, especially after the relief efforts. People were trying to help by, we were talking about selfies also. There was that delicate balance of taking pictures of lavish food or something versus the relief goods. So tell us a little bit about that, what you were trying to say in that article.
Yes, I think there's a new kind of ethics required in a post-Haiyan world. It's not really just kind of individualistic, creating my online identity, managing my online profile, because that is not citizenship. Online citizenship is never about the individual. When you talk about citizenship, it's the art of living with others. It's civility. And in a post-Haiyan world, especially in the context of a country that's just devastated by a big disaster, a country that has high levels of inequality, the ethics online, I think, shows a lot about who we are as a people, who we are as a generation. So the way we manage our online profile says a lot, I guess, about how we view ourselves in public, because that's what our online profiles are. They are public, and it really just showcases how we place ourselves in relation to others or not.
So given this current situation, how would you describe the typical Filipino today? Looking back, comparing it to EDSA 1986, how are we 28 years after?
It's very hard to
look at
the entire Filipino people.
It's difficult.
It's difficult, and an academic will struggle with that. So we'll tend to define our terms. So I think let's look at it from the perspective, I think, of politically active youths.
And also the freedoms, the current freedom we enjoy now.
Definitely there are more freedoms. It's easier, things that a lot of kids do now in cyberspace. They wouldn't have been able to do that during the Marcos period.
jailed for that,
you'd be jailed, you'd be tortured.
No media freedom at all.
No media freedom
We wouldn't
at all.
be here.
And so that enables certain things. But obviously, it also precludes a lot of thought involved in the writing process, because if you can say whatever you want,
Yes.
then you tend to shoot from the hip. But that's fine. I mean, that's obviously a good and fair trade-off. The other thing I'll say is that definitely because of cyberspace and also because of the decline of global youth activism, people are not interested as much in rallies. They're not interested as much in oppositional politics. The kind of activism that you see today are like, people like building houses, or they like going out into public schools and teaching kids,
Kind
things
of
like
outreach
GK
type.
and
Yeah.
Teach for the Philippines. So the mode of social engagement now has shifted towards those forms that has its advantages and disadvantages. And a lot of people are saying that's the new people power. I actually disagree, because I think people, well, that's good. I'm not disparaging any of these activities, but I think people power needs to have some element of political engagement. It needs to involve reforming institutions.
Yes.
So I tell a lot of my students, what is the use of you building all these GK houses when the cause of the lack of these houses is the corruption in government? So a lot of us should do more
Good
to actually
point.
tackle
Yeah.
the root causes of these problems, rather than putting band-aids on when these
Yes.
problems have manifested.
Yes. Nicole.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, of course, they say that now the kind of politics and social movements we see are the type of new social movements who engage in identity politics, because politics right now is so fragmented. You can just pick one issue that you're really passionate about and involve yourself in that, like LGBT rights, for example, or housing or teaching. So it doesn't have to be the whole spectrum of politics that you engage in. Just pick a favorite. But again, the downside to that, like what Leloy pointed out, is that but the system is all connected, right? So for example, one of the things that I always insist on, and I've written about this as well, is, okay, we engage in foundations, we do all of these outreach work, and we think we are doing well. But I think ultimately the traditional structures of power are still there. Why do we have to reach out to poor people if these people have jobs that give decent wages to begin with? I've made an argument for living wage, for example. Why are these companies investing so much in foundations, but they can't pay their people well?
Yeah.
Isn't that a more contentious form of struggle that a lot of the youth should fight for? Because when they enter the workforce, they will be on contractual jobs, and they will start to feel that these are the rights that we have probably ignored. Which brings me back to the importance of more traditional forms of struggle. We take for granted labor movements. We take for granted these movements that fought for weekends. We have weekends because of these rights, right?
Yeah.
So there is still a very important argument to be made in terms of engaging traditional forms of politics, because we also live in a context where the rights that we enjoy, if we take them for granted, it can easily slip away. So right now, benefits, permanent employment, these are very real problems that a lot of young people right now experience. So the terrain of traditional politics, of traditional struggle, still has to be fought.
Well, when we talk about traditional politics, we have to look at Filipino culture.
Right.
A former guest, journalist Vergel Santos, always says that culture is the main problem here, and it's the corruption, the graft, the patronage politics. So it seems that it's hopeless. What do you think about that? Because how do we change this? How do we
Right.
overturn this bad cycle?
I think in terms of culture, the one thing I'd like to point out is the extreme class divisions that are embedded in our culture. I mean, you just look at our city, for example. How do you travel as a middle-class Filipino? You go up a flyover, you end up in a gated university, and then from the gated university, you go up a flyover again, you go home and enter a gated
In
subdivision.
an air-conditioned car.
Or end up in a gated, or end
like
up in
we're
a
not
mall.
a third world country.
Yeah.
It's actually a first world within the third
Yes.
world, right? And those class divisions, they really prevent a sense of civic unity or engagement. And I think that's the main barrier in terms of democratic culture in the Philippines, the fact that we're so class stratified.
Yes, we'll hold that thought. We'll be talking
Okay.
more about that. Very interesting discussion here, but we have to take a short break. And when we come back, we will talk more on the people power revolution. So stay tuned.
May mga nagtatanong ho, bakit ginawa sa Cebu? Dapat ho yata ang sagot, bakit hindi? No? At paliwanag ko, bakit hindi? No? Noong Setyembre po, ng taon 1983, no? Isang buwan, tapos pinaslang aking ama, inatasan po akong magpunta ng Cebu at kumausap sa taong bayan at sabihin kung anong sinapit na aking ama. Dito po sa Cebu, 1983, September pa lang, talaga hong parang wala ng martial law. Talaga hong buong buo sa loob ng mga Cebuano na kung anong tama at paano dapat labanan ang mali at parang malaya na nga ho ang Cebu. Para sa akin ho, kung sasabihin natin kung ang huling yugto o huling kabanata na pakikipaglaban maibalik ang demokrasya ay nangyari sa EDSA, pwede natin siguro masabi ang unang yugto nag-umpisa naman sa Cebu. Kaya dapat lamang nagunitain natin ito.
You're still watching News Cafe on the Solar News Channel. With us are Nicole Curato and Leloy Claudio. All right, back to People Power. Last Tuesday, on the anniversary of EDSA, we had Pinoy at Cebu giving the speech. So you saw that,
Yes,
Nicole.
I
What
did.
did you think of what he said?
Poor speechwriter. Kind of blaming the speechwriter for a bad speech. But that aside, I think it's interesting that they held the anniversary celebration in Cebu this year. I mean, of course, that was a mass mobilization. Cory was there as well during the People Power Revolution. But I think one takeaway message here is we need to pluralize our narrative of EDSA, because we all know that EDSA revolution did not just happen in EDSA. It happened in the rest of the Philippines. And we
Yes.
have to start acknowledging the plural struggles that happened in the rest of the country at that point. I think some people are even complaining that why are you calling it EDSA revolution? It's such a Manila-centric understanding of the struggle, whereas it was an entire struggle that
the
happened
country.
in pockets of the country. The student movements are not just UP student movements. A lot of the student
that's
movements happened also in different parts of the country. So I think one takeaway is we have to pluralize the meanings of EDSA and take it away from a more Manila-centric understanding of what happened.
Yeah.
There's a
Leloy.
book that people should read, From Marcos to Aquino, Local Perspectives by Rizal Mojares and Benedict Kirkfleet, and it talks about the different EDSAs that were occurring at that time. So an EDSA in Fuente Osmeña in Cebu,
yeah.
there's even an EDSA in Marawi City. And so if we look at we pluralize the narrative, we realize that the action really doesn't just happen in Manila. In fact, most of the action happens outside Manila.
Yeah. Even for those Filipinos exiled abroad.
Yeah.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Many people actually look to the Philippines. They were applauding us for People Power 1, and they found this something really admirable. In fact, it was copied in many other countries. But what do you think of the evolution of the People Power concept? How it's commemorated today, Nicole? How
Right.
has it changed?
I think one interesting thing is to contextualize the particular achievement of EDSA 1. Right now, we have all of these demonstrations in Venezuela, in Europe as well, and of course in the Middle East. And people are talking about the Arab Spring, they're talking about Ukraine
Yes.
protests.
Yeah. Yes.
And a lot of these deteriorated into violence. And so we shouldn't take for granted that primary achievement, that we were able to oust a dictator without bloodshed. Of course, there are legitimate issues that we are not satisfied with the outcome of EDSA. But I think one way to respond to that is instead of simply just doing the role-playing commemoration of revisiting all of these monuments, is to start having a more serious discussion of how we want to move forward. Instead of course, commemorating is good. It shows respect, it shows appreciation for what happened in the past, but it has to be contextualized in the current narrative of what democracy not only meant and means, but what it should mean. I think that's a more meaningful way of celebrating EDSA instead of the traditional song
There
and
has to be a
dance.
greater purpose to
Exactly,
it, huh?
yes.
Leloy?
So yeah, it's very easy to talk about democracy as like a functional democracy, meaning we have elections, minimalist, or clean elections. But I think democracy is more than that. Democracy is about whether or not the institutions of the state are responsive to the most number of people. Is there health for people? We have adequate health care. Are we feeding people? Basic questions. And I think if we really want to talk about EDSA as the moment that reintroduced democracy back to the Philippines, we have to start bringing up those questions also.
Right. Well, a lot of struggles we're still going through. And in the speech, last Tuesday, Pinoy also said, kakayanin natin lahat ng pagsubok. What
Right.
do you think about that?
Well, of course, I mean, we have to. We have no choice, right? Yeah. But I think part of that also, I think, should be a stronger emphasis that EDSA is not just about the personalities who are on the stage. The real thing that made EDSA happen are the people that massed in all of these sites. And I think that really just underscores the possibilities for governance in the Philippines. They always say that Philippine politics is always two-faced. Of course, there is elite democracy, but there's also participation from below. They say that the Philippines has the densest network of civil society organizations in the world. If you go to Maginhawa Street in Teachers Village, right? Yeah. It really shows that democracy is in a healthy state, that a lot of people are trying to take part. Of course, the unfortunate part of that is now the concept of the NGO is tainted with the Napoles scandal, but it can easily be resuscitated because participatory democracy in the Philippines is alive. I think the bigger challenge is how we translate all of these intense democratic activities of Muslim women fighting for peace, of LGBT communities, how these translate to broader institutional change. But some people think that would only happen through an electoral system, and I would tend to argue that elections, it's really just part of it. One way of changing the political culture that you've mentioned a while ago is really to take part and find different spaces for governance. So for example, globally, we're being celebrated for our LGU code, that NGO participation is required. We can maximize these spaces to exert influence on an elite government. So yeah, I would tend to assess Philippine democracy using that lens, that it's not just government. Now we're talking about governance. And that's governing with the people and governing where power is decentralized. So there are spaces that we can still take advantage of.
That's right. You mentioned the elite. Leila, you said before that, you mentioned that in terms of the pork barrel thing happening now, people are also disillusioned because the alternate, where do we go to? It's also going back to the elite who are going to be in power. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, it's true. The center of Philippine politics remains largely unchanged. After EDSA, for instance, the first election, at least 2/3 of the House of Representatives came from the same elite families that were around before Marcos. So essentially what happened was you had an oligarchic democracy before Marcos. Marcos ended that by becoming the supreme oligarch, the only oligarch. And then once he was out, the oligarchs came back. And so it's easy to be disillusioned with that. But I agree with Nicole that actually the main benefit of EDSA, or the main legacy of EDSA, is really the burgeoning of civil society movements. So you ask the question, do we live in a vibrant democracy? If you look at it from the center, then maybe not. But if you go to Maginhawa Street again, our favorite street, then maybe you're actually living in a much more vibrant democracy than you think.
Do you think that these little groups also can be a problem because then we don't have this big cohesive Filipino spirit? How could this be a problem? Because there are pockets of revolutions going on. Then what happens is people are spreading the messages too thinly.
Right. Again, I'll give the academic answer. There are two sides to that. One is, if we want that cohesive spirit, then maybe we can do something more substantive. But the downside to that is nationalism also, as we've seen in the Second World War, also has its downside. So when people have that one solid, cohesive identity, it tends to silence the minorities. And I think I prefer the side where, yes, the struggle is fragmented, that yes, people find their own pockets of resistance, but at some point, on a particular important issue, people come together and make a concrete demand for change. I think I prefer that because I would rather have people find their own meaning in politics rather than having a central powerful person or organization that kind of dictates and imposes what kind of nationalism we need in this country. I think that is probably applicable in the 20th century, but not anymore in the 21st century.
And that's sort of what happened before EDSA. When you talked about resistance or activism, a lot of the activists during that time were associated with the National Democratic Movement of the Communist Party of the Philippines. And that's a very centralized system. Now, what happened after EDSA was, well, the Communist Party is still there, but you pluralized that. You had other people who were saying there are many roads towards reform. It doesn't have to be the violent people's warfare from the countryside, a la NPA style. And that's another legacy of EDSA that I think people need to pay attention to.
Well, I'd like to go to that point of the leftist movement. You're part of Akbayan, right? And you're saying that you were reflecting on your experiences of your parents, how the leftist movement now, even they later on when it evolved, it was very different from its roots.
Well, I mean, yeah, the left is now plural. Akbayan is a new left movement. We view ourselves as a post-EDSA organization. In other words, we wouldn't have been around had there not been an EDSA. And the framework of groups like ours and other groups is that, well, maybe during the time of Marcos, you didn't want anything to do with the government because it was just fundamentally corrupt. But now because the EDSA system is in place, there are spaces for democratization wherein you can involve yourself. So for instance, agrarian reform. I mean, we've been very involved in the agrarian reform movement, and we think that even though the government is slow to respond to agrarian reform issues, if you pass bills like the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Program, then you can ease the suffering of a lot of people. I mean, another area that I like talking about is reproductive health.
Yes.
I mean, a while ago we were talking about how there needs to be a convergence in order for change to happen.
Right.
People don't need to converge all the time. It can be provisional convergences. And that's what happened with RH. You had so many groups coming in saying that because there's an opening for democratic involvement here, we will all come together for this issue to reduce maternal mortality, to protect women's rights and women's health. And that's a good example of sort of post-EDSA social activism that brings concrete changes.
Yes. Well, this is where they say sometimes the cons of the democracy is that what you're saying about the RH bill, no? Too many people coming into the debate. This is why, going back to Nicole's point earlier, some people still say that during the authoritarian rule under Marcos, people were afraid of authority and things actually worked pretty well. Do you think that there are elements from the dictatorship that can be brought back today that will actually help?
No, not at all.
Not at all.
I mean, it worries me that
People don't fear authority here.
yes, that's probably why there are a lot of fans of Duterte, for example, who would
Dirty
probably,
Duterte.
he has all of these parang rewards. If you catch a smuggler, I'll give you a Montero or something.
I saw that,
and a lot of people are enticed by that. But I think that's just because there's a vacuum, there's a security vacuum. So let's not confuse the two. Let's not confuse our issues with security with our demand for authoritarianism. So I think, just to answer your question, are there parts of authoritarianism that we want to we want to resuscitate at this point? Probably not. Maybe more investment on culture, the Imelda legacy, more investment on public health.
Those are the priorities.
Or art, then maybe,
Yeah.
but in terms of the system of government, I wouldn't say anything should be resuscitated at this point.
What about when you look at charter change, things like this? What are your thoughts on improving government through our parliamentary system?
I'm not close to the idea of charter change. It has to just be done by the right person. I think a lot of people didn't agree with charter change under Gloria because they thought she was using it for an ulterior motive. But charter change under Pinoy, actually, I wouldn't necessarily be critical of that because obviously he doesn't want to become prime minister or anything like that. So we should definitely open up that discussion. I'm not saying we should have charter change, but just because we were burned by charter change during the Marcos period, that should not necessarily preclude us from talking about federalism or parliamentarism.
Yes. All right. Well, let's talk about, you talked about Pinoy and not wanting to continue this legacy. Now, there's this kind of, when Cory came into power, there was this Cory magic, no? If you remember the snap elections address, she gave a really good speech, and this legacy is being carried on through the administration. You talked about the royal ascendancy of Noy Noy. Why did you refer to that as a royal ascendancy?
Well, that was largely polemical, but it does, a lot of people package it that way, that he became president, and they're not ashamed of this. He became president because he's the son of Cory and he carries that legacy.
Yes.
Well, that's not something you should brag about. I'm not against Pinoy or anything, but the fact that we elected someone because of his connections to his parents means that there's something immature about our democracy. That doesn't necessarily mean that we elected the wrong person, but we definitely elected him for the wrong reasons, if that was the actual reason that we elected him.
Yeah. And you also talked about how the death of Cory was a big changing point in our political atmosphere.
Definitely. I mean, I was in Australia when this was happening, and I was just watching, and everybody knew Noy Noy at the time, but Noy Noy, I think when he won as senator, it was like 10th, 11th or something, very low. And then suddenly he's the most popular presidentiable simply because his mother died. And that says something about how we think about the past
And
in
also
the
his
Philippines.
sister.
And his sister.
Sorry, writing
well,
on his sister's
yeah. So why was that the case? And why did Conrado de Quiros, for instance, call Noy Noy's election as EDSA masquerading as an election? You know, I think these are very poignant questions about the mythology of EDSA that bring up how we think as a people or as an electorate.
Yes. Well, where do you think we need to go right now? Well, the current generation, everyone says the youth today really are the future. And what, for you, Nicole, what is the situation we're at now and what has to be implemented? You always talk about progressive politics.
Right.
And the president needs to focus on progressive governance.
Right. Well, primarily because the president amazingly still enjoys high popularity rating. And for me, it's really such a good opportunity to do something more meaningful and more progressive compared to just institutionalizing structures of good governance. Of course, that's important, but there are a lot of other issues that he can settle. Like, for example, inclusive growth. It's amazing how after he realized that the unemployment rate remains unchanged, that poverty rates remain unchanged, suddenly he calls for a cabinet meeting and starts a discussion on we have to do something different. But if we look at the policies, it's the same policies, economic policies that we've implemented over the years. So I guess that's where I'm coming from.
Right.
For such a popular president and still implement policies that are a bit traditional, that are not so imaginative, that's a bit frustrating. So I guess in terms of the question of where do we go from here, I think probably people have started talking about 2016, but I think instead of focusing on personalities, on who we can choose as president, maybe now is the time to ask, well, as a people, which kinds of politicians can we actually build up and support for 2016? Because it's not enough to have a good president, for example.
Yes.
It's not enough to have a good congressman in one district. It has to be a critical mass of progressive politicians. And we have to start now. Because all of these trapos have started hiring all of these consultants to fix their image and run surveys. So I think if the people are serious in creating something progressive for 2016, then we have to do something right now and make sure that there's a critical mass of progressive politicians that's going to win in 2016.
All right, well, good point to ponder. While we take this short break, we'll just take another quick break, and when we return, we will have a final word from our guests. Welcome back to News Cafe on the Solar News Channel. I'm with Nicole Corato and Leloy Claudio. All right, guys, I want to ask you about the current state of course, where we are right now after EDSA. We've just celebrated 28 years of EDSA revolution. What do you think needs to be done, let's say at your generation now, looking at elections coming up, 2016, top priorities that we should look into, Leloy?
I just want to build on what Nicole was saying a while ago. It can't be about personalities. I mean, even anti-corruption cannot be about personalities. So it's easy to say, let's impeach Merceditas Gutierrez, let's impeach Chief Justice Corona. But those are stopgaps. What will cure corruption in the long run are sustainable mechanisms like the Freedom of Information Bill, which allows anyone to participate in the process of anti-corruption. So I think in terms of sustainable reforms and electoral reforms, you need to look at measures that actively involve the people. Because the Freedom of Information Bill is essentially about the people. It's saying that if people have access to the information, then they can use that information to build democracy from the ground up. So from an electoral perspective, that's very necessary, because what we're going to do now is essentially we're going to start scrutinizing our politicians again.
Yes,
and we need to be very, very strict with them. And we need to, as early as now, as Nicole was saying a while ago, we need to know who we're going to root for already. And we need to build up an alternative constituency. And I think it's already very clear who the politicians are that we shouldn't vote for. I mean, it's very obvious who the turncoats are. It's very obvious who the people involved in pork barrel scams are. And an indicator for electoral maturity will simply be a repudiation of these people in the polls.
Nicole?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just go back to the point I said earlier, right? That first of all, elections, we cannot equate democracy with elections. Elections is just a process of changing our leaders. But also we have to underscore, as I've mentioned, that being governance is not about government. It's also about the people. But in terms of youth involvement in 2016, I think it will be a very interesting election because it will be highly hinged on social media. That's what they say. So the terms might change a little bit. But what worries me is, again, if we use social media and allow it to inform how we make our decisions, a lot of people are still out of it. And they think social media is something that makes voices equal, but it also creates hierarchies. So we have to watch out for what kinds of people are having an amplified voice in social media, influencing our
Yes.
decisions politically.
Yes.
We have to be very critical about that.
Yeah.
I think some people are pushing for social media literacy in the curriculum,
Yes.
especially in K-12, precisely because it's so hard to be discerning in social media. When someone tweets something, some of that is paid. And we have to understand the political economy of social
Yes.
media. So I think that's also another way of preparing for 2016, how we shape our opinions as
Yeah.
voters, as campaigners, and as citizens.
Yeah, and definitely I might add that virality should not be a criteria through which we judge news.
Trending, no.
Yes.
Neither is it how it makes you feel, whether or not it makes you inspired or anything like that. The criteria we should use is really whether or not it's accurate, it says something that will benefit people as voters, if it's, if it's from an electoral perspective.
So to the ordinary citizen, you're saying educate yourselves.
Right.
How do you filter through all the information out there? What do you recommend? What, as an ordinary citizen, how do I prepare myself for the elections? What do you, of course, read Manila Review.
Of course, yes.
Read Rappler. But what do you think we can do to empower ourselves as ordinary citizens?
What I've recently done, and I should have done this earlier, is to like Facebook pages of personalities and news organizations that I don't particularly like. For example, I liked a Republican newspaper. The reason for that is because I can't just keep reading things that I agree with already. I have to broaden my perspective, because that's one of the critiques of in a social media world, where people just read things that they like and they start creating enclaves of discourses,
Yes.
and they stop reaching out to other people. So
Right.
I think that's one of my suggestions for people who want to educate themselves. Try to broaden the range of literature that we read online. So in that sense, we have a sense of what's happening outside of our little enclaves.
Yeah.
We also should start talking to people who aren't like us. We have to start talking to people that we disagree with, and
Yes.
start learning the ethics of engaging in politics online. It's so easy to share a really nasty meme of Nancy Binay, for example. Of course, it's funny for a lot of people, but we
Yeah.
have to start thinking about the politics of that, the ethics of that, because in the end, we
Yes.
may not be then aware of the consequences of these things, because everything can be just shared.
Elevate the discussions
Exactly.
by opening up your mind to other
Exactly.
perspectives. Now, this is what I admire about both of you. You've really taken it up a notch because you've pursued further studies. You're both doctors. Now, this environment for scholarship, I want to ask your experiences from the Philippines and abroad. You both studied in Australia, also the UK.
Yes.
So what do you think about the environment for mentorship and scholarship in the Philippines versus, of course, I mean, maybe it's unfair, but versus abroad, like first world countries?
I don't want to make like broad generalizations, but I try to always tell my students that you are here not simply to listen to me, but actually to engage and debate me.
Yes.
But the perspective is usually, you're the teacher, we're going to take down notes, we want to hear what you have to say. And that's not a healthy learning environment, actually. A one-way learning environment is a terrible learning environment, because the best way to learn is through articulating yourself against the opinions, or pegged to the
Yes.
opinions of another person. And that's just something I feel we need to encourage in our classrooms more.
I agree. Nicole?
Yes, I've always told my students that my teaching style is democratic. In fact, I ask them to call me by my first name, just because I want to feel that they respect me, not
But they
because
don't, right?
Some do, most of them do. But
It's difficult for them. though.
Of
It's
course, I
difficult for
understand
them.
that there are the
Uncomfortable.
norms of respect and authority.
Right.
I get that. But I guess by doing that, what I'm saying is we are interlocutors in this class, especially in a university context. In the university, you don't teach, you create knowledge. And you create knowledge through the process of dialogue and discourse.
Yeah.
I think that's something that we have to sharpen at this point in tertiary education, because we're training people to be obedient, but that's not what we
Yes.
need in the 21st century. We need thinkers, we need
Critical
people who are
thinkers.
responsive,
Yeah.
we need people to be creative,
Yeah.
we don't need obedient people.
And I liked what you said. Last year, you won the 10 Outstanding Young Men Award, and you were saying this is the year of researchers and how they're actually giving importance to creativity and research.
Right.
So that's what we need: brain rain rather than brain
and
drain.
that's part of the democracy building process. If you run a democratic classroom, I tell my students, if I can educate you to think democratically in the classroom, then when you leave the classroom, you know how to challenge authority, you're already thinking democratically.
Yes. All right, now so we have come to the end of our program. I'd like to ask your final words. Let's start with you, Leloy. If there's something we should remember about EDSA, if there's one thing that we should always keep in mind about the EDSA People Power, what would that be?
It's that there are always threats to our democracy, that we can easily slide into an authoritarian system, but that a vigilant populace that knows when enough is enough can change things. And I mean, that's very cliche, but the basic message of EDSA is that you can do something and you can make a difference. And that is already a cure to apathy. So what I think we should be encouraging young people to do is actually to not just complain about things in the government, but actually do something about it. So I'm glad that when Pinoy won, a lot of people, at least in my university, decided to join the government. And that's a really
Yes.
good indicator of putting your money where your mouth
Yeah.
is. But it doesn't have to be joining the government. It can be joining a social movement, joining an NGO, basically thinking about a society broader than, say, the narrow confines of a corporation
Right.
where you make money.
So give something
Yeah.
back, right, to the community. Nicole.
Yeah, I think it's the simple idea is democracy is an unfinished project and we all have a lot of work to do. And by we, I mean citizens. It's not about the government, it's about us taking part in that unfinished project. We all have our own homeworks to finish.
Yes. And on that, thank you for all you do for contributing to our brain surge back to the country. So thank you very much again
Thank
for
you.
being on the
Thank
show,
you.
and all the best to you. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for tonight. I'd like to thank our guests tonight, Dr. Nicole Corato and Dr. Leloy Claudio, for being with us tonight. Now, if you have any comments on the episode for tonight, please share them through our Twitter and Facebook pages. Join us again next Thursday for another round of interesting conversations here on News Cafe. I'm Mitzi Borromeo. Good night.
Sa karoon sa bukod, yun na ba nakasalanan ng video?
Media educators